If my information is correct, I believe we are on the amendment moved by my colleague from Calgary-South East on my behalf when this was adjourned. Perhaps I'll just confirm with you that that's in fact what we're on. Thank you very much. I thought so. First off, just want to say a word of thanks to my colleague from Calgary-South East for moving that amendment on my behalf. And I think what's been, I will say without much hesitation, probably it has been the most rewarding process that I've been a part of as part of the 29th Legislative Assembly has been the work that we have done together as part of the Child Intervention Panel. What was, I think, so compelling about that work was the challenging subject matter that we tackled together in a cross-partisan way. Being an all-party committee, we had the opportunity to really dig deep into what is a very complex and a very challenging issue that has been a topic that has been investigated in numerous committees, reports, excuse me, by the Child and Youth Advocate, previous panels and committees of members of the Assembly. Many ministers have tried to tackle this, improving the lives of kids in care, in particular Indigenous children in care. And I think it's important that we remember why we started this process in the first place, which is the case of Serenity, who died very, very tragically, having been in care. And we should never forget what the circumstances were that led her to be in that very terrible situation. And none of the changes in this bill will be able to undo that terrible, terrible tragedy. And we should never, ever forget that. What we need to do is focus on what we can do to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. And I'm, I think, confident that the changes that this bill brings should give us more opportunity to say that we took this challenging issue forward, and we should be in a position where I think this does improve the lives of kids in care. It does improve the likelihood that fewer numbers of children will come into contact with the child intervention system, and in particular creates a pathway for Indigenous children to get better care, to stay connected with culture and with community and with family. But back to the process, and that's the substance of the amendment that I've moved. This bill, like many, will be reviewed every 5 years. But in so doing, I thought it was important that we put some parameters around what that review is. If it's simply a matter of sending it to a committee of the Assembly, while that can be effective, this subject matter has some very specific requirements in terms of overview. And 5 years from now, I would hope that we'll have the opportunity to say that we have made substantive progress, that we've reduced the terrible overrepresentation that we see of Indigenous kids in care. 69% of kids in care are Indigenous, and only roughly 5 to 10% of kids in the province of Alberta are Indigenous. So there's that vast overrepresentation. And that's why I've moved this amendment, which will create a review committee composed of one or more persons who are representative of Indigenous communities, guardians and care.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Elbow.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to respond to a few of the comments. I talked in my first remarks, my initial remarks about the this process, how it was a cross-partisan process, and I want to be careful because I don't want to dig. I don't want to get too deep and sort of push back too hard. But I do take issue with a number of the things that the member said about a lack of accountability or a lack of action or a lack of oversight. The system is the same as it always was. It feels like no. I'm gonna try to keep this I'm going to try to keep this high level. Look, this morning we had public accounts with the Ministry of Children's Services, and we talked about their action plan. So coming out of the Child Intervention Panel, there's a detailed action plan, some 39 actions that were to be completed by 2022. That's on the website. You can look at it in the Child Intervention Action Plan. And there's 16 immediate actions to be completed by April 2019. Now, there's a website that lays out what those 16 actions are. Part of one of those actions is to pass Bill 22. And what I asked the ministry officials there was perhaps if they could provide us with some more details on that website about the progress on each one of those 16 areas. But it's not correct to say the system hasn't changed. It is not perfect and frankly never will be, but action has been taken. The Bill 17, which we passed last spring, gives the Child and Youth Advocate, specifically to your sub-amendment, Honourable Member, the mandate to review every single child death. And one of the things is I talked with the minister and her officials about this amendment that we see before us now, my amendment A2. In fact, my original draft had the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate included in there. And some of the reasons why the minister suggested that perhaps should be taken out, and I agreed, was that the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate is always doing the work of ensuring that children in care are treated appropriately. If there is ever a death as tragic as it is, the Child and Youth Advocate will do a report on that death, and he issues his office issues reports on a regular basis. So the mandate is bigger than it was previous to Bill 17. And that review is for not just children up to age 18, but up to age 21, because one of the things we heard in the panel was once children age out of care, they sort of fall off the radar, and that's something that you know, if a child ages out of care and dies from suicide or from some other reason a day after their 18th birthday, that's important for us to understand as a community. As to how it is that happened. So the Child and Youth Advocate continues to do that work. And to the member for Calgary-Shaw's point, I think there is some legitimacy to part of the panel's work in the outset was to review the role of the Child and Youth Advocate. And I think in 5 years' time, when this bill is reviewed again, I would hope that panel does also look at the work of the Child and Youth Advocate with the benefit of 5 more years of time and looking at the reports that office has done. And I'm absolutely certain certainly if I find myself in this assembly 5 years from now, hopefully on the government side, I can assure you that I will make sure personally that the review panel would make sure that the Child and Youth Advocate presents to that panel, likely more than once. I can imagine there would be an entire stream of work related to presentations by the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, as there was for the Child Intervention Panel. The OCYA, Mr. Graff, and his team came to visit that panel on multiple occasions. So I'm comfortable in saying that the work of the Child and Youth Advocate and the input of that office, as well as a review of the appropriate role for that office, would be considered in this panel going forward based on the amendment that we have before us, and so I see no reason to add the OCYA to the panel as the sub-amendment suggests. Thank you. So I just want to ask a question, and I don't know, frankly, if the government can answer this, and of course our friends from Parliamentary Council can't speak to this specifically. But you know, just to what the member for Calgary-Shaw had raised, the only question I would have about this, the concern would be, would we find ourselves 5 years down the road having a review committee which would be precluded from going in camera to hear very personal stories? And that was a big part of what this past Child Intervention Panel was all about. It was not a common thing. It's not something that the panel did very often. The vast majority of our proceedings were in public, but our deliberations were not. They were in camera. And I think that's appropriate. So I guess my question would be would this create an perhaps unintended consequence of constraining the work of the committee, preventing that committee from having very open dialogue about very sensitive matters? Would it prevent people from coming and presenting to the committee in a way that would be comfortable for them? There are many people who perhaps had lived experience being a child in care as a now adult, or perhaps even there may be a scenario, although we didn't have this last time, and I don't know if it ever would be appropriate to actually have a child who's currently in care or had lived experience with that under the age of 18%. As I recall, we did not have that in the child intervention panel, but we did have some now adults in their early 20s who had been children in care, and I guess feel that this amendment may perhaps unintentionally preclude future reviews from hearing the lived experience of people who have been in care. I understand the intent that the review committee must be conducted in public. I'm a big believer in open debate. That's a big part of the reason that I'm in this assembly. But I also acknowledge there will be times, especially in cases like this when we're dealing with child intervention and children in care, which have some very legitimate confidentiality and privacy considerations, that we need to be mindful of those. Yes, if this past process is any indication, and certainly I would hope that based on what I'm proposing in my amendment, the intent very much is to have a very public and very open review. The wording around that the committee must submit a report to the minister, and that report shall lay the report before the Legislative Assembly if it is sitting, and if not, within 15 days after the commencement of the next sitting of the Legislative Assembly. So the amendment, as I've proposed it, already does have some significant transparency, I guess, requirements, and that's very much the intention. And the other, I guess, fail-safe, if you will, in my current amendment, which perhaps renders the amendment for the member from Calgary-Hayes redundant, is that one or more members from each caucus represented in the Legislative Assembly would be part of the process. And I hate to predict the future, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but if we have opposition parties that are not of the same ideological bent of the government of the day, I suspect they're probably not going to allow for too much secrecy in the review process. If there was too much secrecy, I suspect that they would create a minority report and also kick up a fuss in the media, as well they should. So I have to say that having gone through the process we just went through, my intention with this amendment is to, in the future, recreate that process. And now that I've said that on Hansard, I hope that historians 5 years from now will go back and remind that committee in terms of its terms of reference. That's very much the intention of this amendment as we put this into legislation, is to replicate as close as possible to the process we've just gone through here in the Child Intervention Panel. But that process did have some in-camera sessions. And so my question and I guess a concern would be that if we do pass this sub-amendment, that we would constrain that panel's ability to do that important work and respect confidentiality as necessary. Thank you.
Any other Calgary